Good evening from Lowell Observatory and welcome to our 2021 Pluto Circle presentation. I'm Lisa Actor, I'm the Deputy Director for Development here, and I want to welcome all of our Pluto Circle members. Thank you for tuning in tonight. And here we are, a second year with a virtual presentation and no reception. So let's hope for 2022 that we can do this live. I'm pleased tonight that we are speaking about Mars from Mars Hill, and our speakers are Jennifer Putnam, who is the great-great-grandniece of Percival Lowell. Jennifer is a student, a PhD student in the Department of History, Classics, and Archaeology at Birkbeck College in the University of London. And it's the middle of the night in London, so thank you, Jennifer, for tuning in with us. Our other guest is Bill Sheehan, who is sitting here in my office. I'm going to give him my seat in a moment. And he and Jennifer will talk to you about the furor of Mars that has attracted human interest for centuries now. Bill is a psychiatrist who retired in 2018. He considers himself as much of an astronomical historian as psychiatrist, and that's well-deserved because he's published over 20 books in various themes of astronomy, including books on the planets in our solar system, 3 of which have covered Mars. And Bill has a book coming out this fall with a colleague, Jim Bell, called Discovering Mars, A History of Observation and Exploration of the Red Planet. Our plan is to send a signed copy of this book to all of our Pluto Circle members once it is released this fall. So watch your mailbox for that, and we'll look forward to sharing that with you. So I'm going to turn the conversation now over to Jennifer and Bill and let them talk about why is it that humans are so fascinated with Mars and the history of human fascination with Mars. Take it away, Bill.
All right, so are you going to start, Jennifer, or should I say a few words?
So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Lisa, for a wonderful introduction. Before we begin, I just want to explain how I got involved in this project. I'm not a historian of astronomy. I'm a linguist and a modern historian, and I was kind of accidentally drafted into this work. Some of you may know that 3 years ago, I was asked to translate one short letter from Percival Lowell to Giovanni Schiaparelli that was found on the dawn trip to Librera Observatory. And this is that letter. I agreed, not knowing that this one letter would turn into 2, would turn into 5, each time being promised that it really was the last letter, which was only true once we reached the 42nd letter. Initially, I really hoped each letter was the last, as they're a lot of work, and reading 19th century non-native French handwriting from a partially blind astronomer is no small task. But I have to admit, I was slowly drawn into the warm and gentlemanly relationship between these 2 men, letters filled with mutual respect and affection and their deepest desires to know Mars truly and fully. It was a pleasure to get to know Lowell and Schiaparelli through these letters, to feel their highs and lows, and to share in their awe at their discoveries. By the time I reached the end, I was fully invested. My heart sank at Schiaparelli's last words to Lowell. I felt as though I were saying goodbye to 2 friends I had made through their letters. I say letters, but I mean correspondence, as there are telegrams, postcards, notes, letters, long and short. Their correspondence was mainly in French, with a few short postcards and telegrams in English. The majority of the correspondence is held at Librera Observatory in Milan, who were incredibly helpful, and several letters are held at Lowell Observatory archives, many of which were unearthed by the wonderful Lowell archivist Lauren Amundsen, to whom we owe a great debt of gratitude. We framed some of our discussion today about Mars using quotes from the correspondence, as Lowell and Schiaparelli made reference to the past with gratefulness and references to the future of Mars with hope and confidence. They weren't always right, but their dreams and aspirations helped to change and encourage the study of Mars to this day. Over to you,
Great.
Bill.
Thank you, Jennifer, for being willing to keep astronomers' hours tonight for us and to share your fascinating research on Schiaparelli and Lowell. I, as a historian of Mars, first got interested in the planet when I was 9 years old. And at that time, shortly before Mariner 4 made its flyby of Mars, it was still just possible to believe in the canal networks that Schiaparelli and Lowell spent so much of their career studying. And so I do remember the fascination that never leaves you when you encounter it in childhood that has stayed with me the rest of my life. But I've learned a great deal from the research that you've done on their correspondence. And I think that that's a contribution that is very significant in enlarging our view of planetary astronomy and particularly the study of Mars of that era. So what I'm hoping to do is to try to frame your study of the letters by showing just how it was an important chapter and what's really been an epic of fascination with Mars that has extended since very, very early times. And obviously, the first people that paid attention to Mars were those of whom we know nothing. Mars has attracted attention since prehistoric times. It was studied by the Babylonians. And why don't you put on the letter that between them talking about the early backgrounds of astronomy? This one, yeah. Read that one for us.
Sure. So Schiaparelli wrote to his friend Percival Lowell in 1907, I have recently studied some observations from the Babylonians of Mars. This planet is especially precious. It has evaded the first attempts of the Babylonians. With his method, Kepler discovered its first two laws. Now it will reveal the mysteries of life on another world. It is the terrestrial Mars, that is to say war, that must be abolished.
Excellent. And could we skip to the next slide and try to remember? Right, so Mars is an amazingly charismatic object, particularly when it's close to the Earth. And this is a little passage that I'll read from Walt Whitman, the famous poet, who noticed it when it was at one of its favorable oppositions in the 1870s. Coming back to St. Louis this evening at sundown, and for over an hour afterward, we followed the Mississippi close by its western bank, giving me an ampler view of the river. In the eastern sky hung the planet Mars, just up and of a very clear and vivid yellow. Next slide. It was a soothing and pensive hour, the spread of the river off there in the half-light, the glints of the downbound steamboats plodding along, and that yellow orb, apparently twice as large and significant as usual, above the Illinois shore. All along these nights, nothing can exceed the calm, fierce, golden, glistening domination of Mars over all the stars in the sky. Next slide. And there's Mars as it was a couple of years ago in conjunction with a couple of famous Messier objects in the night sky, showing its brilliant hues. Next slide. So Mars has interested people for a long time, and there are a couple things that make it stand out from all the other objects in the sky. One is that it has a fierce red color, and there are very few objects in the night sky that are reddish in color, so it immediately attracts attention. There are a few stars, but otherwise red is just a striking color to notice in the sky. And the other thing is that Mars is not a very stable, even-keeled kind of an object. It's somewhat manic-depressive in the sense that it flares up into this angry brilliance every 2 years. And at times it is so completely overpowering, as Walt Whitman pointed out when he saw it under those conditions in 1879, and it's really the most arresting object in the night sky. And then it fades away. It's like an ember that's dying after a fire, and it is obscure. So it had both this intense red color and also this very, very dramatic swing in its apparent brightness. Next slide. It's also a master illusionist. So in addition to being really brilliant at the times that we mentioned, it also makes a very unusual, takes a very unusual path in the night sky. It goes along the usual direction of its motion, then suddenly it reverses track for a while before proceeding again in its normal way. And in ancient times, when the Earth was believed to be the center of the universe, this was very difficult to explain. And Greek astronomers used an epicycle device to try to make Mars. This was a small circle attached to a larger circle that in turn revolved around the Earth to make Mars make this unusual zigzag motion across the sky. And it was only Copernicus in the early Renaissance that was able to show that if you displace the Earth from the center of the universe and instead put the sun there, that this motion was revealed to be an illusion. And one of the themes that we're going to be discussing tonight is that Mars is a master of illusion, and it's fooled us a number of times through its compelling feints and sleights of hand, as it were, although Mars doesn't have hands. Next slide. Another thing that Mars bestowed upon humanity is the secret of the way that the planets move around the sun in the solar system. Mars has a fairly circular but somewhat eccentric orbit. It actually moves in an elliptical path. And other than Mercury, which is difficult to observe, Mars has the most eccentric, odd-shaped orbit of any of the planets. And Tycho Brahe, who was on the left in this picture that I took in Prague, made very careful observations of Mars with the naked eye. That was before Galileo invented the telescope, obviously the only means that people had. But basically using very sensitively designed measuring instruments to determine the positions of Mars. And he passed away, bestowed upon Kepler the legacy of trying to take his hoard of observations and extract some truths from them. And Kepler was able, by studying Mars's motions very carefully, next slide. This is the Belvedere in Prague, which is where Tycho made his last observations. Lovely view there. Next slide. In this house in Prague, Kepler, using all of these complicated geometrical diagrams, was able to work out from Tycho's observations that the motion of Mars around the sun, and hence by deduction the other planets, was elliptical rather than circular, which is one of the great discoveries of modern astronomy, and that took place in the year 1609. Next slide. Let me talk a little bit more about the color of Mars. Red is a fascinating color. It has an extremely arresting effect on human attention and desire. And in fact, when I was a psychiatrist, I was trying to design a test for ADHD by using different colors, understanding that the color red is probably going to biopsy the attention of kids, even that have ADHD. I never worked that out, but red is significant in the natural world because it is both an attractant, as many flowers deploy it in attracting pollinators, but it's also a color of warning. And so it really captures our attention because you have to determine whether or not you want to approach it or whether you want to avert it. And so this is a tree frog from the Amazon. I hope they're surviving down there with all that's going on, but intensely red. And obviously this is a way to basically dissuade any kind of predators from approaching. Next slide. Sunset, remember the old saying when I was a kid, red skies in the morning, sailor's warning, red skies at night, sailor's delight, which captures that somewhat bipolar aspect of the color red. Next slide. There's a very famous painter named Mark Rothko who only paints in red and uses the extreme power of the color in his compositions. Next slide. Hemoglobin, of course, is red, and it has an iron atom at the center of the hemoglobin complex that combines with oxygen. So essentially, when red blood cells turn red, it's actually a form of rusting. The hemoglobin combines with the oxygen because the purpose of the red blood cells is obviously to carry that through the body. But and in Mars, which was also considered to be blood red and has lots of associations with bloodshed and war, the same moiety, that is iron, which oxidizes on the surface of Mars, is what gives it its reddish color. So there's a full circle there. Next slide. Here's Mars shown as red in a fresco from Pompeii. Mars, of course, was the god of war. Next slide. And there it is in a telescope. So Mars has attracted us because of its color. And when people started using telescopes, starting with Galileo in 1609, the same year that Kepler, by coincidence, deduced the elliptical motion of the planet, people started looking at it through telescopes. It was way too small for Galileo to make much of it. But within 50 years of his first deployment of the telescope in 1609, telescopes had improved to the point where these very evocative features started to reveal themselves on Mars's disk. Next slide. Sorry, that's a segue that we don't need to follow. Next slide. The first person that really had a decent look at Mars was Christian Huygens of Holland. And he made a drawing in 1659, which compared to drawings of his own time and actually for a couple centuries following was almost miraculous in the detail that it showed. And Percival Lowell himself said of it, it was the first drawing of Mars worthy of the name. And you can see his drawing in the lower right part of the frame. And what he saw was this darkish patch that looked somewhat triangular in shape, and we now call the Syrtis Major. And at the time, of course, no one knew really much about what the planets were like, but the tendency was to compare them to what we knew, and we knew the Earth and we knew the Moon. And so Mars was seen from early on as probably a brother planet to the Earth, and so like it in many ways. Next slide. Sorry about all these. In 1783, wrong date there, William Herschel, a great musician turned astronomer, observed Mars, and he thought that what he saw there was analogous to continents and seas. And he said that the analogy between Mars and Earth is perhaps the greatest in the whole solar system. And at the end of his learned disquisition about Mars, he said, the inhabitants probably enjoy a situation in many respects similar to our own. So Herschel implicitly thought that Mars was inhabited. Next slide. As the 19th century got underway, at first very difficult to make out shadings on the planet, which astronomers couldn't even agree as to whether they were permanent features or a shell of clouds, eventually were stabilized in their perception. The first map of Mars was made in 1830, and by the 1860s, it was starting to be studied by astronomers, including even geologists. And this is an exquisite map of Mars by John Phillips, who was an astronomer at Oxford. And again, notice the coloring, because as I said, Mars is a master of illusion, and a lot of those colors will reveal themselves to be somewhat deceptive. Next slide. Okay, we'll pass over this real quickly. Next slide. But it's an important point to make relative to Mars, and that is that the colors that we perceive are not independent of the context. What we see as a color is really definitely partly determined by the colors against which the first color is compared. And that discovery was first made by this chemist named Chevreul, who was hired by the French dyeing industry because they were concerned about when they created and wove these marvelous and expensive tapestries for aristocrats and the royalty. They found that some of the colors didn't look quite right. And so Chevreul did a very careful study of that. Next slide. And what he discovered was essentially that is true, that if you have a gray swatch seen against a reddish background, the gray swatch will seem to be slightly tinted bluish green. And similarly, other colors will exhibit somewhat the complement of their colors. So he invented the color wheel, and he also showed that it was really important for tapestry makers to consider the relationship of the different colors of yarn that they use to make their tapestries. So what does this have to do about Mars? Is Sheehan just showing off his erudition, or is there a point he's trying to make here? Next slide. There is a point to be made. So what I've done here is create a little exhibit, psychological exhibit. And in the middle of this is just a neutral gray square that's seen against a perfectly white background. So that's sort of our control slide. Next slide. Now notice, and if we can jump back and forth, Jennifer, between those two slides, notice that as we go back and forth, when the gray swatch is seen against the light background, it appears darker, and it actually seems to brighten in intensity, even though it's the same neutral square. So this is a demonstration of simultaneous contrast. What we see is relative to the background. Next slide, and then next one. Same is true of Mars. Now that's the same gray swatch that I showed in the previous slide, but now I've put it against a kind of an ochreish background. And at least to me, I don't want to bias anyone out there, but it's supposed to look a little bit bluish. Does that seem to be the case? Next slide. And now if I put it into a black background, what we're seeing now is what is called by people that study color and seeing aperture control mode. And essentially what we're seeing is what Mars would look like in a telescope, where you have the background dark and the eye kind of does some adjusting to make as smooth a transition among the various colors that it's being asked to analyze. And so you can see there that these colors have come a long ways from the neutral gray that we started with. And that's going to be significant when we look at Schiaparelli and Lowell and their views of Mars, which we are going to come to soon. Next slide. This is a drawing by Father Secchi, brilliant Italian Jesuit astronomer. And he was the first person in the late 1850s who drew Mars in color. And as you can see, this particular feature that appears to wind and then curve back again is the Syrtis Major, very narrow at that era. And he called it the blue scorpion. Ray Bradbury referred to these colors, and they continue to appear throughout the early history of Mars observations as the blues that are not really blues. These are essentially simultaneous contrast effects of observers that were basically trying to see the colors as best they could, but saw these illusory ones that we're talking about. Next slide. All right, so in 1877, Mars made a really close approach to the Earth. And there were a couple students of Mars that had very different viewpoints about what its surface was like. One was Nathaniel Green, a British portrait artist. He actually gave lessons in art to Queen Victoria. Here's an image from one of his books on how to draw. He went to the island of Madeira and made some observations of Mars, which eventually led to a map. I'm going to show in the next slide some of his earlier renderings of Mars, which are quite exquisite. Next slide, yep. And he combined them into a map. So his style of representing Mars is very romantic, very kind of gauzy, with a naturalistic kind of appearance of the features. Nothing is really very regular. Everything kind of melts into the background, as you'd expect of a professional artist. Next slide. The other person that I'm introducing here, one of our protagonists, Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was a professional astronomer who had a tremendously good training in all the methods of astronomy, including the precise measurement of double stars, the ability to draw very accurately surveyed maps where every position was carefully worked out with a micrometer and put on a grid so that everything was very exact. And he also had some peculiarities. Schiaparelli suffered from male color blindness. He was a deuteranope, so he had difficulty in distinguishing greens and reds as a certain number of males do. And his other eye, he had a sort of a lazy eye condition, so his other eye wasn't very good. So he really only had one good eye. But he was very skillful and very well trained and had a very clear purpose. And there's a nice little picture I added just to humanize him a bit with his family. He was quite a bit shorter, I think, than Lowell. Next slide. So this is Schiaparelli's set of drawings from the same opposition as those that Green had made his drawings from, observing from Milan. Next slide. And they produced two different maps. It's hard really when you look at these at a glance to even convince yourself that they're showing the same object. And this just shows what's sometimes called the personal equation, just how differently things are, in the way we see them. And so the one on top is Schiaparelli's map, which everything is very precisely delineated. Schiaparelli, because he was colorblind, I believe, actually tended to be more perceptive of very nuanced shadings. In fact, when I was in medicine, one of the things radiologists told me is they always look at radiology pictures in neutral grays because you can tell little lines of demarcation more readily that way. So, and everything is precisely measured. Schiaparelli used a micrometer and measured everything precisely. And because of that, I think he tended to exaggerate the intensity of the different places because what he wanted was something unequivocal and clear. Green, on the other hand, his map is on the bottom, shows the same planet, but instead seen through the eyes of an artist. And as astronomer of the time said, one has drawn a picture, the other a map. And we'll see that theme resurface when Jennifer starts talking about Percival Lowell and Giovanni Schiaparelli's correspondence again. Next slide. All right, so we've introduced Schiaparelli, and another person that's important to our story is Camille Flammarion, who had his own observatory in Giudice. He was a wonderful romantic, popularizer of astronomy. He believed emphatically in things like spiritualism. He thought that people could communicate through mediums. He was unequivocal in his belief that planets, and in particular Mars, were inhabited. And he had a tremendous following. And in fact, the book that I'm showing the cover of is unique in my experience, at least. It's leather bound. It's in the library at Giudice, or at least it was, which is where he had his observatory. And it's the only one that I've ever seen which is bound in leather made from human skin. And this was made because he had an admirer who so admired him that basically she wanted that to be her way of, I guess, remaining in contact with him. Next slide. So Flammarion wrote a book in 1892. And that same year, Percival Lowell had just departed from San Francisco to Tokyo Bay for his last trip to the Far East. He made 4 grand adventures there, wrote several wonderful books. They're still worth reading as much as his Mars books because they're so romantic and beautifully written. Next slide. And the last one he wrote when he was there in 1892 to 93 was called Occult Japan. Lowell had become very interested in the possession of some of the pilgrims on Mount Antaki. They believed that they went in these trances where they believed that the gods communicated with them. And by the time he ended this project of writing this book, he said, "How ill the self fares under these illusions and disillusions of the trance." He became somewhat disillusioned with this mysticism and all of this kind of thing as he worked through the book. And I think he was looking for new frontiers to conquer. Next slide. And when he returned, a big book sort of plopped onto his, I don't need it for this, for him. And this is the book, the very book. This is the copy of Camille Flammarion's Planet Mars. It bears an inscription, Percival Lowell, December 93, from Aunt Mary, who I finally figured out, I think, actually through the auspices of William Lowell Putnam III, that this was his cousin, Mary Trail Spence Lowell, who was James Russell Lowell's sister. And she gave this book, and there's a scrawl on there that says "hurry." And I think Lowell, who read French fluently, was so utterly captivated by this book that he couldn't wait to launch his own investigation of Mars. And this book is not only important because Flammarion wrote with such a romantic approach to Mars that it was impossible to resist, but also Flammarion summarized all of the observational history of Mars going back to the time of Huygens's observation in 1659. And in particular, he summarized in great detail all of the great observational memoirs that Schiaparelli wrote. And Lowell didn't read Italian, but he read all of these in French. And I think he realized that Schiaparelli was the person that had the inside story about Mars. And from that time on, his admiration for Schiaparelli was set, as it would remain for the rest of his career. Next slide. And these are just a few little vignettes of Lowell. The Comet Donati, which he remembered as his first memory from 1858, a picture of him with his younger brother Abbott, and the Seven L's mansion in Brookline, where he and his family settled after the Civil War, and the library, which is actually it wasn't the observatory, but it was actually, I think, the library where Lowell's ideas about Mars germinated the most. Next slide. Well, anyway, so Lowell took this telescope, which is not more than 50 yards, probably feet from where I'm sitting, and he took it to Japan with him, and clearly his interest in Mars was already starting to, or at least in astronomy, was starting on that last trip to the Far East. Next slide. And there's the gentleman from whom I learned that inside information, and I know Jennifer knows him well, knew him well. Next slide. And so Lowell came back from Japan. He was back in December 1893 in Boston, got this wonderful book from his cousin, aunt, and spun a plan almost immediately to set up this observatory. And there's a little known document that exists. It was clearly written before he had made any scientific investigations of Mars. But Lowell, to my view, what is probably the most wonderful thing about him is not so much his scientific side, but his poetic side. He was just a master of language. And had a very poetic nature that he tended to suppress perhaps a bit later in his career. But he wrote a poem that I first studied when I was here way back in 1982. No one had really paid much attention to it. But I think it captures the romanticism with which Percival Lowell started his quest for Mars, And I'd like to have Jennifer read us a little bit of that.
Sorry, I changed the slide over when I was trying to unmute myself. I wish I could read you this whole poem. It is fantastic. Amazing find by Bill. Just an amazing poem, but I'm just going to read you a small snippet. So I'm starting kind of from the middle. We know just enough to long to know more of that first habitable shore across the ocean of the sky. Ocean whose ether waves of light, buoyant to naught more gross than sight, to thought alone give passage o'er to where the telescope's piercing eye lets wandering earthbound man descry unpromised land he may but spy. A sister planet whose sister face, featured so familiarly, complete in all its rounded grace, mirrors much that our earth might be could we once above it rise, to behold it in its entirety, sailing along through pathless skies. Already far on with advancing age, has it passed its life-bearing stages, and has that spirit already fled from that planet of war, once doubtless rife with myriad forms of happy life, waging natural selection strife? But are the survivors themselves all dead? Or is Mars yet inhabited? Far sights have been seen there stranger yet, adventure's appetite to whet, tracings Schiaparelli has spied, so-called canals in parallel pairs that for 1,000 miles run straight nor swerve, save as parts of great sickles curve in bended sickles from side to side, from certain centers stretching out to band the whole great globe about, and changing in hue with the changing year, from a dark green tint to an ochre clear, wearing with the varying mantle that verdure wears when fields of grain from lush grow sere, colors that elsewhere come and go over the surface of Mars as its seasons grow.
It really is. It is a magnificent poetic effusion, and I think it captures perhaps more than some of the more scientifically oriented books, the romanticism of Percival Lowell and the vision that he had even before he came to Flagstaff to look through the telescope. And ye who seek shall find, and so he did, as we'll continue to find out. Next slide. So anyway, Lowell left Japan sort of disillusioned with trances of the Shinto pilgrims on Mount Ontake, and came to his own eminence, Mars Hill, which is a beautifully named place with a classical allusion. But he borrowed a telescope, and with a couple other astronomers from back east, he set out to essentially lay siege on Mars. Next slide. He was again entranced. So the irony is that he basically became disillusioned with the difficulty of discerning one's subjective wishes and self-mystification of the Shinto trance rites, with the difficulty of discerning where the line of subjectivity and objectivity runs when one is looking at a planet. Some of the more stodgy, unromantic professional astronomers basically didn't, they poo-pooed, that's a phrase that Lowell liked, his endeavor, and said on one occasion stuffily, Lowell had not selected the right kind of companions for his astronomical picnic. They thought that he should have instead taken up astrophysics. What he needed was some young, well-equipped astrophysicist sounding conservative to sit on his coattails and keep him down to business. And as everybody that knows much about Lowell knows, he had already given up on business quite a bit before then. So next slide. This is a page from Lowell's observing logbooks, and it really is a document that records his enchantment with the planet and how he learned to see. And next slide. These were the first drawings. And as he went on, he was observing independently of some very eminent astronomers. And he was relatively a neophyte. So the two drawings on the left were by Edward Emerson Barnard, who is an extremely acclaimed and judicious professional astronomer. And the ones on the right were the ones that Lowell made. They were done almost simultaneously. One was done near San Jose and the other one in Flagstaff. And what Lowell, because he was just basically an amateur that had a great interest, missed, and we'll show later that it was crucial, was a dust storm on Mars, which he drew as a canal. Next slide. And here is Lowell's summary drawing of Mars, and this is probably a good time to bring this out. A beautiful drawing showing those lustrously beautiful but illusory colors. And at the time Lowell started out, he believed that he was seeing seas and deserts on Mars. But by the time he finished his first series of observations, he realized that seas didn't exist on Mars, and instead those were vegetation. And here's this wonderfully exquisite little globe that he made in 1894. I don't know how he did it. I wouldn't have had the patience. I think I would have destroyed about 10 of these before I gave up. But he made these every couple of years. And this shows some of the same features as are shown in this drawing. And it's just a wonderfully unique object. I don't think you could ever get a price for that would be worth its weight in nostalgia. Next slide. Well, let me quickly run through this, and then we're going to talk about, Jennifer's going to talk about the correspondence with Schiaparelli. But anyway, Lowell's views about Mars after his first season of observing, he came to several conclusions. One was that Mars was a much older world than the Earth, and he embraced this idea of course, evolution, not only Darwin's theory of evolution, but that of Herbert Spencer, a philosopher that basically tried to interpret everything in terms of evolutionary thinking. So Mars running ahead of the Earth, its continents had smoothed down, its oceans dried up. He believed mistakenly that Mars is flat. He thought its air was thin. Next slide. And this is another kind of fatal mistake that he made. The first and most conspicuous of Mars's characteristics is cloudlessness. A cloud is an event rare on Mars, a rare and unusual phenomenon which should make it more fittingly appreciated there than Ruskin lamented was the case on the Earth. Next slide. So we thought despite the thinness of the air, that it was important that we not extrapolate from our experience on Earth and life on Earth to what might be possible on another planet where life could have evolved to a very different destination. And what he wrote, and this was in his book 1895 book, Mars, one deduction from this thin air we must be careful not to make, that because it is thin, it is incapable of supporting intelligent life. Lungs are not wedded to logic, as public speeches show. A fish doubtless imagines life out of water to be impossible. And similarly, to argue that life of an order as high as our own or higher is impossible because of less air to breathe than that to which we are accustomed is, as Flammarion happily expresses it, to argue not as a philosopher, but as a fish. Next slide. Lowell did have a dry sense of humor, obviously. And he concluded basically that Mars, because it was more advanced than the Earth, it evolved further, was dry and flat, that if there were intelligent beings there, essentially the way that they would survive would be through a massive irrigation project. And so what he really concluded was that they were able to pump water from the polar caps, which were believed to be water ice, and in fact, and partly are, to the equatorial regions in order to support irrigation. And that essentially, in a nutshell, was his theory, which he worked out when he went back to Boston at the end of 1894. Next slide. And when he finished his book, there was one person in all the world that he was more concerned to impress with his arguments than anyone else, and that was Giovanni Schiaparelli. And so began this wonderfully scintillating and insightful relationship between these two men, both dedicated, as Jennifer said earlier, to try to understand Mars, and sparring with each other at times, and trying to, particularly Schiaparelli, kind of poke holes in some of Lowell's arguments, because I think initially Schiaparelli thought that Lowell perhaps should have seasoned his thinking about Mars more than just 1 year. But over time, they came to have great respect for each other and indeed affection. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to guide us through this wonderful project that she's discovered.
So they began corresponding, as far as we have records, in 1896, when they were sending telegrams to each other about what was happening on Mars and with the observing conditions. But their letters really picked up in 1898. They began corresponding at a time when Lowell was just beginning his observing career, and Schiaparelli's was winding down due to his declining eyesight. In this regard, their correspondence offered something to the other. Lowell gained Schiaparelli's valuable insight, which he coveted, and Schiaparelli was able to continue to advance astronomy without having to look through a telescope himself. As we go along, I'm going to show you some of the letters. Please pay attention to the handwriting. Lowell's is, as always, very beautiful and carefully written, but Schiaparelli's writing becomes more and more spidery, as the transcribers at Brera put it, and less legible, reflecting his declining eyesight but refusal to dictate to someone else. As Schiaparelli wrote to Lowell in 1898, Thomas C. informed me that your health has not been very good lately. Everyone truly hopes that it will get better so that you may be able to continue your unfinished works in a manner as brilliant and as grandiose as before. As for me, I am done. My vision becomes always more imperfect and more insufficient for this sort of observation. I should be able to observe the planet well enough for my own instruction. How happy I am to be able to check the numerous discoveries with which you have enriched areography. Just as a little footnote, if you will, areography is a word that was frequently used by Lowell to describe the study of Mars, coming from the god of war Ares, for whom Mars is named. But it's not really a term that's used much anymore, so maybe we can bring it back. So Schiaparelli did check Lowell's discoveries. Lowell began sending his drawings, such as this one from the 25th of February, 1903, and images from his observations. Rather comically, Lowell wrote to Schiaparelli in August 1905, I would have sent you the first photographs of Mars if a newspaper had not announced your death. Unfortunately, the newspaper was, as always, wrong. Now I am in a position to send you even more beautiful photographs that Mr. Lampland has just taken, and where you will even be able to recognize what your eyes saw first. It is almost inconceivable that the art of photography could reproduce them. Mr. Lampland's skill and the atmosphere have overcome the odds. Lowell regularly sent plates with what he hoped were fascinating discoveries to Schiaparelli, and unfortunately, Schiaparelli was often obliged to dash Lowell's hopes. In Lowell's observations of the opposition of Mars in 1907, Lowell believed he could see proof of Mars's seasons, vegetation, and canals, as he mentioned previously. He asked Schiaparelli, his Martian master, to review the images, writing, you and you alone should create the representation of what one might see in the photographs of Mars that I sent you. Because, in spite of what you write to me about your poor eyes, you can still see much better than Mr. Antoniadi or anyone else who has not studied the planet well. Do this honor, please, for science. You can see in his reference or put down to Mr. Antonia D., a fellow astronomer and critic of Lowell's canal theories, Lowell's competitive and defensive nature about his unwavering belief in the canals. He was so convinced there were canals that the staff of the observatory at the time jokingly said that he was digging them himself, producing this image. I hope you can see in the middle, it's just a picture of Lowell with like a shovel in a field, and they've just put it on Mars, which I think is very cute. So back to our main story. For the purposes of reviewing a great number of images from Lowell's observations in 1907, Schiaparelli acquired a new microscope. I put myself in touch with Mr. Karistka, who is a skilled maker of microscopes, and I instructed him to make a microscope of low magnification with a micrometric reticle for drawing and eventually measuring as well. At which point, Schiaparelli noted some errors in the photographic methods of Percival Lowell. He wrote back to Lowell stating, "The first discovery that I made is very disagreeable. The enormous quantity of details that one could easily recognize on your discs do not all belong to the planet. At least such is my opinion at present. But in many cases, I can even say very often, to the lines and spots of the planet are added other, too numerous details that I would not know to admit as being part of the surface of Mars, and many others which seem to be of a doubtful nature. Maybe they are an effect of the particular molecular state of the sensitive film, or even of the plate of glass that holds it." As you can see from the length of this letter, Schiaparelli found a good many things to comment on and correct in the plates. Lowell, as we know, did not often take such criticism well and sometimes ignored it, and believed rather stubbornly that his theories were correct. As his poem and passionate writings about the canals and life on Mars show, he truly wanted to believe in something more than dust, and was willing to see the cracks and the negatives as lines on the planet. Schiaparelli was not so easily swayed, however, stating, "There is a recent upsurge of skepticism towards the Martian configurations, and it is for me a misfortune not to be in a position to assure myself through my own observations of what is and what is not. I believe that all the contestation will be finished the day that we can obtain photographs of Mars large enough to put an end to all the uncertainties stemming from photographic granulation." With this letter, Schiaparelli sent a large box of observations that he thought might aid Lowell's work and his final book on Mars. In return, Lowell wrote back to Schiaparelli, sending some images from the opposition of Mars in 1909, signing his letter "From the Heart." Sadly, by the time his letter reached Milan, Schiaparelli had passed away, leaving only his final words to Lowell. "I won't trouble you with my Latin because it's not very good, but neither was Schiaparelli's. This is a misspelled line from Aeneid, translated as, 'Here as victor, I put down my boxing gloves and my art.' In spite of this, I will always be very interested in the great progress that astronomy makes every day, and some of which will mark the belle epoque in the history of this science." Lowell continued his work without the sage advice and guiding hand of Schiaparelli, still confident that the canals existed. There is good news, however. Schiaparelli's dreams of high-resolution images of the surface of Mars are now a reality, as Bill will show you later.
Next slide. All right, well, I'm going to quickly summarize sort of the lingering romance and kind of what we know about Mars now. The biggest thing that people, including Percival Lowell, but most of his contemporaries didn't realize is just how dusty a planet Mars is. Next slide. And even some of the color changes that Lowell recorded that he thought showed evidence of vegetation burgeoning and then dying out with the seasons turned out, in fact, to be partly exercises in the simultaneous contrast involving colors that we talked about earlier, because some of these areas were affected by dust storms, and that changed the intensity of the brightness of some of the areas. And so, in fact, one of the great ironies was that this wave of darkening that Lowell described where he thought that as the seasons advanced, the features became more dark as the water from the polar caps reached these thirsty desert regions. Really was a wave of brightening that dust storms occurred and brightened up the lighter areas of the planet. And so these other areas appeared darker by contrast. Next slide. So this is an example of what Lowell thought he was seeing from 1894. His early observation shows what appears to be a very dark area. And then as the opposition continued and the polar cap disappeared, the features faded out. And instead, this array of canals, which showed that the Martians were busy pumping water during that period of time, irrigated these little channels along the canals. And Lowell never claimed that people were seeing the canals themselves, but instead these strips of vegetation on either side. So this was a fairly convincing demonstration in Lowell's views of these seasonal changes in vegetation. Next slide. What he didn't realize were that these dust storms were occurring. In fact, they occur with great frequency, and dust on Mars is pretty much ubiquitous. There's always a haze in the atmosphere. These are some drawings of a dust storm in 1909 by the much maligned Mr. Antoniadi that we heard mentioned before, and who really was Lowell's bête noire. You can see that in the earlier drawings, the dust is so pervasive that actually the dark areas have faded out completely. And then gradually as the dust settles out, the dark areas reemerge. This is something that really wasn't recognized until about 1909. Next slide. There are canal-like features. Here's another drawing by Father Secchi, and these kind of winding, broad streak-like features do exist on Mars, and they also are related in ways that we can't go into to dust storm activity. But basically, that winding feature is real, and we've seen similar images from orbiters and so on. And I'll show you some later. Next slide. But this is what's going on. So in the first couple drawings or the first couple images from 2018 show sort of a normal Mars. You can see the polar cap area, and then a dust storm developed, which spread dust all around the planet and completely wiped out all of the features. I remember being very exasperated in 2018 because we're really gearing up to use the Clark refractor to observe Mars. And then we ended up with this sort of ball of haze, and you couldn't have seen less in a department store telescope. And you can see the one below is a much higher resolution image, but there's just a sheet of dust that's sweeping across the planet and enveloping everything in its wake. Next slide. And here's one of another post-dust storm thing. It's not a very good image. It's from Mars Global Surveyor. And I took it as a screenshot, but you can see there's this dark marking which has temporarily been laid down after a dust storm. And these were markings that genuinely were visible on Mars and had a canal-like form, and both Schiaparelli and Lowell recorded quite a number of these. And I would call those class 1 canals. The next set of slides is going to explain the class 2 canals. There's another image, artist's conception of a dust storm on Mars. And this is not Los Angeles, this is Mars. Really want to go there on your vacation? Anyway, this is a long quote, but basically one of the things that I realized when I first came here to study in the archives back in 1982 was that when people like Lowell observed Mars, they were basically seeing images that were only crystal clear for fractions of a second. And then because of the atmospheric turbulence, everything would blur out. And so, as Lowell says here, that basically of a sudden be made aware of a vision as of a thread stretched somewhere from the blue-green across the orange areas of the disk, gone as quickly as it came. He will instinctively doubt his own eyesight and credit to illusion. And then seeing this over and over again convinced him that it was real. Next slide. And here's one of the pages from his logbook that just shows this kind of fleeting view of things from one moment to the next, which he tried desperately to capture in his sketches. Next slide. So again, we said Mars is an illusionist, and that brings me to sort of my penultimate topic, and I'll breeze through it really quickly because it's quite complicated and involves a lot of stuff about like brain processing of visual information, but I'll give you at least a gist of it. Next slide. So one of the problems is that when people looked at maps and photographs of Mars, they tended to think that they were looking at the equivalent of a still picture, like the vase by Van Gogh. I would love to own that painting, by the way. But in reality, what they were looking at was much more like the painting on the left, which I think was by Géricault or one of these kinds of people in the early 19th century, which is a horse race. And horses gallop so fast that it's impossible for the eye to freeze frame the way that the horse's legs are moving. Next slide. There was a change in the way that people thought about vision during the 19th century, partly because trains started to appear, and trains were moving a lot faster. And so people's views, even of the countryside passing by, was very different from, kind of the slow movement of peasants, fishermen, people like doing their everyday things, and from the time immemorial to the 18th century. And people started to try to capture this a much more fluid and impressionistic style that speed and transportation was bringing to the fore. And that gave rise to Impressionism. Next slide. The first person that actually worked out how a horse gallops was this fellow named Edward Muybridge. And he was able to devise the first stop action device. And apparently he won a bet for his patron, Leland Stanford, who founded Stanford University. And basically one of the bettors, who obviously was wrong, thought that all four of the horse's legs rose above the ground at the same time, whereas as these frames showed in winning Stanford's bet, that isn't really the case. I guess it is. That one looks like it. Well, anyway. Next slide. So anyway, what we see when we see Mars is a lot more like that galloping horse. And so the turbulent atmosphere causes these perturbed wave fronts, and we only get a plane wave where Mars becomes crystal clear for a fraction of a second, maybe an eighth of a second, or maybe a little bit more. And I remember when early in my investigations corresponding with Clyde Tombaugh about that, and he completely verified that was the case. So we're seeing this wobbly little thing there that we're trying to essentially use our brains to freeze frame. Next slide. And there was a device that was developed for studying these short-term images called a tachistoscope. And so there's a body of psychological knowledge about this, but it was never applied to astronomy until I did that in a book that I wrote in the 80s. Next slide. But essentially, so this is the retina. And actually, these are my retinas, believe it or not. And the one on the right has an interesting appearance. It's actually a fairly benign condition where calcium salts precipitate onto the retina, and it's called asteroid hyalosis. So even my right eye has a little bit of an astronomical designation to it. But so the retina isn't a particularly good patch of film, but fortunately there are lots of things that go on in processing the image after it falls on the retina. Next image. This is a long story, but this is Percival Lowell's map of Venus. And actually, I think what he was doing, because he stopped down his telescope to such a low aperture, was he turned his telescope into an ophthalmoscope and he was mapping the vessels of his own eye. No one's come up with a better explanation. Next slide. So anyway, that when the light from Mars, which we just see for a short period of time, falls on the retina, there's all sorts of intricate processing that occurs to extract information from that. And I'm not going to go into all of this stuff, but I'm going to test you tomorrow on what the geniculocalcarine tract is. And if you'd rather write an essay on optical radiations, I could give you that one too. Next slide. Very complicated stuff goes on, and essentially, so what the eye does, and it's all taking place at the brainstem. When you see an image like that of Mars, you see a flash of detail, and the eye makes these saccadic movements to try to bring the fundus of the eye, which is the most sensitive part of the retina, onto whatever it is that's captured its attention. And anything that's in motion, of course, has an effect on basically these unconsciously motivated movements of the eye, but it can never quite catch up with something like Mars. Next slide. And this just shows what these saccadic movements are like. So the saccades tend to concentrate on all of the most significant features of an image. And I think what some of the finer canals, not the really prominent ones that I showed earlier, but all of these fine spindly lines that Lowell and Schiaparelli recorded were essentially records of their own saccadic eye movements as they tried to follow in these glimpses of detail what they were actually looking at, which include these little patches and spots and some of those kinds of things. Next slide. And so keeping that in mind, essentially, I think that these drawings of Mars from the last year of his observing career, 1916, are essentially very detailed records of the saccadic movements of his eyes as he was attempting to trace out this detail on Mars. Next slide. Next slide. These are just views of Mars through the, well, now we're on Mars, and I'm going to quickly summarize. Do we have time?
Yeah, we should finish up.
Yeah, we're going to try to finish up, but I want to just say that Lowell was right in a lot of ways about Mars. It is a desert planet, drier even than he imagined. Water did run on Mars in the past. It does have an atmosphere. It's much thinner than even Lowell believed. This atmosphere is continually obscured with a haze of dust, as we've talked about, all of which were things that Lowell didn't appreciate completely. This particular image is from Perseverance rover. My co-author, Jim Bell, is actually the principal investigator for the Perseverance Mastcam Z camera that obtained this image. And so we're now looking out at Mars, and some people that see these images think it looks a lot like Arizona. They'd like to get out there in their shirt sleeves and walk around. And there are even some billionaires that would like to escape to Mars and set up colonies there. But a warning, and that is that if you did go out onto the surface of Mars, you'd find an extremely inhospitable planet. It's much colder than the Antarctic. The air is about the same as at an altitude above the surface of the Earth of 30 miles, and essentially unbreathable, and so on. And there's essentially no water at all in liquid form on Mars. The atmosphere is too thin to support that. And so essentially, Mars is a salutary warning to us that there really is no place like home. Next slide. And there we are. One of the wonderful things, there's a manuscript that's never been published, but I love it because it's Percival Lowell's description of a visit that he paid to the petrified forest of Arizona in 1909. He should have been observing Mars, but he took a little bit of a leave from that and went to petrified forest. Stretching before us in long swells, its rise, like other things in life, was more perceptible in looking back. And I think that the final proverb of all of this that Jennifer and I have attempted to present to you with our story of the fascination of Mars is how many of the things that fascinated about Mars were illusions, and that ultimately what we sought most on Mars was actually what we already had on Earth. Next slide. And so home sweet home, it's kind of like the end of The Wizard of Oz with the ruby slippers. But this is a paragraph with which I'll end, by Arthur C. Clarke, The Sands of Mars, which is the first major science fiction work about Mars that didn't include the canals. Well, this is it. Actually, maybe I should. Jennifer, why don't you read this, please?
Sure. Well, this is it. Down there is all my past life and the lives of all my ancestors back to the first blob of jelly in the first primeval sea. No colonist or explorer setting sail from his native land ever left behind as I am leaving now. Down beneath those clouds lives the whole of human history. Soon I shall be able to eclipse with my little finger what was, until a lifetime ago, all of man's dominion and everything that art had saved from time.
Beautiful, thank you. So that's it. You're gonna.
Yeah, let's see. I don't know if we have any questions.
It looked like Daniel had something going.
Let's see. I need to be able to the mouse there. Let's see. Here's a question from Jim Davies. Hi, Jim. Is there room for art when observing Mars anymore?
I think there is, yeah. Am I coming across? I think it's all art, to be honest. I mean, a lot of the algorithms that are used for image processing are basically patterned on the retina, and use things like lateral inhibition, opponent process to create images so that they look like what our eye would see. And I think there are still lots of discoveries to be made by comparing what somebody looks at through the telescope and is able to paint and record that way with the archive of observations that goes back to people like Schiaparelli and Lowell and even before. So, and besides the scientific value of it, I think art is what we humans do. And I think that ultimately, you gain more from sketching a tree than you do from taking a photo on your cell phone of the tree. In the one case, you observe, and then the other, you just record. So yeah, I emphatically believe that, and I, with very limited artistic ability, continue to find great pleasure in doing it. And I know a lot of other people that do. Great question.
There don't appear to be any more questions. So
let's turn to the answers then.
I'd like to thank you both. Jennifer, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jennifer, for making time in the middle of your night.
Yes, for joining us from London in the wee hours.
And I'm so glad that this just hasn't been buried in the archive. I was so worried that after spending 2 years translating everything, the words that I had translated would turn to dust. And I've been so fortunate that Bill picked it up and really wanted to make something out of it and contextualize it and put this into the history of our fascination with Mars. So thank you so much to Bill, and thank you for everyone who's listening and isn't letting this turn to dust. And thank you so much, Lisa and Lowell Observatory, for having us.
Well, and to you for taking the time to translate all of those letters. It really is lovely. Thank you for sharing some of those with us.
And it was the introductory offering of the Journal for Astronomical History and Heritage for their new From the Archives feature. So it got top billing in that distinguished journal. So Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your effort in making that accessible to historians for as long as there are historians of Mars.
Okay, well, and thank you, Pluto Circle members, for tuning in. Watch your mailboxes for a copy of Bill's latest book on Mars.
All right. Good night, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Pleasant dreams.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us. All right.